Welcome to another great conversation on Think Radio Presents Think People.
Think People is made possible in part by support from the Community Foundation of the Gunnison Valley. To learn how you can make a difference, visit cfgv.org. The Community Foundation, we're here for good.
Become a Think Radio Presents partner at patreon.com, and you'll also get access to premium content you won't find anywhere else. Join us today.
My guest today is sociologist, author, and Episcopal priest J. MacLeod. In 1987, MacLeod published a book called Ain't No Makin It, Aspirations and Attainment in a Low-Income Neighborhood. For 4 years in the early 80s, he had lived and worked with young people in Clarendon Heights, a public housing development in a city in the American Northeast. Ain't No Makin It is a stereotype-busting account of what he learned about structural inequality in the U.S. economy and what he terms achievement ideology. MacLeod has updated the book twice since its original publication and joins me today to talk about how the story changed over the years, but why it's as relevant as it ever was. Jay, thanks for joining me today.
Pleasure.
You know, I would like to begin by sort of orienting the audience on the landscape. Your book is really well known in sociology circles and probably also in social justice circles, I would think. But I think it's fair to say that the average person might not have come across it.
Absolutely fair to say.
And so let's begin with an elevator pitch.
Okay.
Tell us, if we were at the library right now and that book wound up in our hands, what's inside?
What's inside is an account of what poverty looks like from the inside in a northeastern city, focused on two peer groups, teenagers, one largely white, one largely black. The interesting thing is criminality was almost completely confined to the white group, which are called the hallway hangers. They were all, dealing drugs, getting arrested, fighting, all sorts of criminal enterprises. But there was a rationality that went alongside that. They weren't, to the outsider, they just looked like self-destructive hoodlums. But actually, they understood that, given the hand they were dealt, they refused to gamely engage in a contest they felt like they were destined to lose. So instead of buying into the American achievement ideology, they kind of defaulted and created their own sort of subculture in which to be bad was to be good. The contrast was with the African-American kids who actually bought into the achievement ideology, put out, in school, were respectful of authority, had aspirations for middle-class respectability. And so I explored the differences in that kind of surprising that it doesn't conform to our stereotypes.
Imagine that. And so you spent a number of years not among them necessarily, but in close contact and studying these people. At what point did you realize, wait a minute, this is not conforming to my stereotypes?
So it sort of worked in the reverse. What I did is I transformed a work site into a research site. So I'd been running a youth enrichment program for 4 summers. When it came, I was an undergraduate, deeply involved in this community work. And when it came time to write my undergraduate thesis, instead of spending countless hours in the library, I decided to spend it down in Clarendon Heights, a low-income housing project, studying, as it were, not the kids in the youth program, but their older brothers, and focusing specifically on their aspirations. Because one of the things that really struck me about the younger kids with whom I was working was that in this ostensibly open society, this land of opportunity, that the aspirations, the dreams of these kids didn't even cut across the lines of social class. So 1981 to 83, I was working down there, 84, then really spent a year and a half doing the participant observation and the research, the interviews with the guys. But the first edition of the book raised as many questions as it answered, the principal one being, what happens to these young men? And it was interesting because I got kind of slated not in so much in academic circles, but in popular circles. The review in the Washington Post, branded me a Marxist and said that, I was full of it, really, that these white kids clearly were self-destructive burnouts. They weren't going to succeed and shouldn't. And these black kids, well, they would succeed. That we just need to give them a chance.
Based on their attitudes, their relative attitudes.
Right. And sadly, when I went back 7 years later, far from being, too pessimistic about the brothers, the group of black kids, that I'd actually argued in the first edition of the book that with a disciplined readiness for the rigors of the workplace, a positive attitude, a high school diploma, they should be capable of landing stable working class jobs. And sadly, when I went back 7 years later, that simply wasn't the case. The white kids, as we'd expected, had done poorly. A lot of them were in jail. They're just living just on the edge in marginality, still involved in the underground economy, still dealing with addiction, alcohol, and drugs. Few had forged meaningful romantic relationships. But the brothers had also struggled, and that was soul-destroying, to see they'd done everything they were supposed to. A couple of them went on to college. Only one managed to graduate from college, but was still struggling in this deindustrialized United States. The good jobs, manufacturing had all gone, and the ones in, service industry, information processing, they had moved to the suburbs, which were beyond their physical reach and their educational attainment. So they were really struggling. And they didn't have access to one thing the white kids did, which was what I call white ethnic networking, jobs working for the city, jobs working in construction. So
people that they knew that they could call on and say, hey, give me a shot.
Right. Can you give me a hand up here? And, the other thing was that, in previous generations, the kind of working class, they were working on the shop floor and insulated a little bit from both their supervisors and, their clients or the consumers would be, thousands of miles away. But in the new service economy, these kids were rubbing shoulders with both their supervisors and with the public. So like three of them, one was working, busting tables in a posh restaurant. Another was photocopying in an office. A third one of them was working at the register at a health food store. And they found it really difficult interacting because these weren't kids. These were kids who bought into the achievement ideology. They didn't look like hoodlums. But neither did they convey a kind of mastery of middle-class culture. And so, black street culture has been so sensationalized and even demonized. This was in the 80s and 90s that they found it difficult to bridge that. And so they felt like they were, really looked down upon. People were scared of them, whether it was their supervisors or the, public with whom they were dealing. So that was kind of tough going back in. The original research was I started working in this housing project in 1981. Finished my degree in 84, submitted the thesis, ended up getting turned into a book, went back in 91, and that's when I discovered this reality. But then my publisher convinced me to go back 15 years later, 2006, when the guys were really entering middle age and find out how they had fared. And the interesting thing was that some of them had managed to get a foothold on the job market. One or two of the brothers and a couple of the hallway hangers as well, including some that looked like they were destined for, prison. One of them, he learned roofing, from an old Irish immigrant, and he learned it well. And he went down to Florida, started, just bid for a couple of jobs, worked out of his car on his own, and just built up a roofing business from there.
Well, what would you say to the people then who would hear that story and say, well, that's what we're talking about?
Right.
That pessimism about their chances was overrated, that anybody can do something like learn roofing. What's your answer to that?
Sure.
In the context of all three of those stages of research.
Well, they're right. Pessimism is overrated, and the hallway hangers all came to appreciate that. Looking back, and even originally as 15 and 16 and 17-year-olds, as much bravado as they had, when they asked to describe what their lives would be like in 20 years, they were, clearly emotionally pained that they felt like they would be in jail, strung out, dead. And in retrospect, of course, they all wish they had applied themselves more because as much as they, weren't willing to play the game, they also, there's no other game in town. This is it. And so they do wish they had, applied themselves, been a little less self-destructive. But of course, we do have social mobility in this country, but it is so limited. But we have to have it because that legitimizes, we have to be able to point to the one or two self-made folks and then imply that everyone can. But my point was like, look, when we look at our job structure, it's not just a pyramid. It looks like the Eiffel Tower. And even if everybody, was conscientious, applied themselves, that the structure of wealth, of the class, of the job structure in this country is going to relegate the vast majority of people to jobs that are, in this instance, low paid, few prospects for mobility. And so I would say to them, yes, I celebrate that a couple of these guys have made it, but it was a couple, and all of these guys had huge potential.
Well, because that is a very bleak view of humanity to say that, no, this exists because such a large number of people simply have no potential. That can't be the case. It just simply can't be true. We've heard this story about overcoming these odds often enough.
Right.
It just can't be true. But I want to go back to something you said, because this picture you paint of the brothers, they've done everything right. They've got the diploma, and now they're stuck in a situation where not just structural economic inequality is against them, but also racial.
Right.
They're bussing tables, but nobody really trusts them because of how they look.
Right.
I want to ask you this. Even if one of the hallway hangers, one of the white kids, had found himself in that job or herself, so what? Those jobs are not the kind that you can build a prosperous life on.
Right.
And so is it fair to say that the kind of economic inequality you're talking about applies to everybody?
Sure. I mean, this is, part of, I think, the power of the book is because it reveals that it is, of course, there's racial injustice. And, of course, I don't deal with girls at all. And they're dealing with gender barriers to success.
Right.
But that what tends to be denied, in this country at least, is social class. All of these kids live in a class society committed to the denial of that. And that has begun to change in recent years. And if you had told me 10 years ago that a self-declared democratic socialist would come close to winning the Democratic nomination for president and hold his own in all these debates, I would have thought, you're on cloud cuckoo land. That's impossible, not in these United States of America. But that hasn't proved the case. And that's actually quite important. So when you hear someone like Bernie Sanders articulating a critique dealing with economy and social class, that gives both the hallway hangers and brothers and all the rest of us some analytical tools that we didn't have before. And so one of the tragic things for the hallway hangers is they understood they were getting the short end of the stick, but they actually, bizarrely understood because they were white men. Right? When in fact, that was the thing that gave them a leg up on the job market. But they felt, again, given the kind of conservative ideologies that they were drawing on, it was affirmative action, it was that all the immigrants are getting the jobs, and they were victimized as white men. So their kind of understanding or insights that, the deck is stacked against us, they would articulate, most of them, that in a way that was kind of quite reactionary and just didn't jibe with the facts.
Well, in the book, you basically point out that they tended to blame others, whereas the brothers tended to blame themselves.
Right.
Is that true? You still hold that view?
Well, I mean, to a certain extent, the hallway hangers would blame themselves as well. So that would be accompanied by some sort of critique of the wider society. And you're right, but for the brothers, it was almost exclusively holding themselves accountable. And, it's only really, in my experience, in these United States of America where that's the case, where there's such a stigma attached to being poor, where it's, so often a badge of shame. And you see that just played out on the streets over and over again. I mean, my first day in our youth program that we ran, when the poor kid turns up, one of the first day, it was the fourth day, and I took them hiking up in my native New Hampshire, and they had to bring their lunches, and kid turns up with what used to be, remember the old Surefine Cola, the kind of generic drink, and all the other kids are all over him. Your mother can't afford to buy you a proper soda, and you just see that replicated over and over again. And so my argument is that sociology isn't just an academic discipline, it's a survival skill. And I had to learn it because I brought into this social world all the biases, assumptions, prejudices from my own sort of lower middle class, rural, white upbringing in New Hampshire. And I had to unlearn, quite a lot of that. But more importantly, that the young people themselves need to become sociologists so they can understand and not blame themselves exclusively, but see the kind of the way social inequality has weighed on them and has not quite infected, but affected, their heart and their minds. And we see that very clearly, I think, in aspirations, because that's kind of mediating what the society has to offer and their interpretation of that.
Well, sure. And if you don't first aspire to something, you're never going to reach it.
Exactly.
And so limitations there are very damaging. I had a guest recently named Anthony Zaragoza. He's a professor at Evergreen State College in Washington. And the class that he teaches, he calls it neoliberalism in your neighborhood.
Right.
And it's the idea that we say a word like neoliberalism, and most people think that's somewhere else.
Right.
That's happening in the third world or so forth.
Yeah.
But his point is to make people aware that, no, look around.
Right.
It's everywhere.
Right.
Do you find that as I read through some of this literature and these issues, I get a little disturbed by some of the jargon and how limiting it is. A phrase like structural inequality, what the heck does that even mean?
Right.
To average people. If you were going to put that in just real nuts and bolts sidewalk terms, what would you call that?
Yeah, that look, kids living on one side of town versus kids living on another, they're not getting a fair shake. Their life chances are severely limited because, if they're coming from poverty, they can't parlay their gifts into academic success, in the same way that a middle-class kid could, a middle-class child could. And that by going to school and you're getting grades, that legitimizes it, right? It says, well, it's not that your inability to parlay, that your cultural there's another jargon, sorry, the cultural capital, what you're bringing. You may be very sharp, you may be witty, you may have all kinds of gifts, but that aren't recognized in the school setting. And you come out struggling in school, and it seems that that's just all down to you. And that, of course, then you can't parlay academic success into financial success, don't have the connections and all the rest of it. So structural inequality is referring to not the individual, but the job market, the jobs that we have. We've got a few extremely high-paying jobs and a lot of jobs down at the bottom that are low-paying, don't have great prospects for upward mobility. And that's the structure. And no matter what we do as individuals, somehow that structure is going to limit us. And so if suddenly everybody achieved in school and teachers were all perfect and everyone had equal educational opportunity, that structure of the job market, of the class structure, would still limit us. And that does reach into people's minds. And so, I went off to, after doing the work in Boston, went off to England for 3 years to study. But then with my wife, went down to rural Mississippi for what was supposed to be a year and quickly turned into 4 years. And again, we just saw so clearly how opportunities were so severely limited in that community, but also grounds for hope. So there were things that—
Well, let's talk about that. What gives you hope?
Okay, so Holmes County, Mississippi has been historically very heavily African-American since the time of slavery, still 75% black, dominated by a white elite of bankers and plantation owners, but is an incredible battleground for the civil rights struggle. And in 1963, when all the attention was focused on Birmingham, Alabama, and Dr. King, which you might consider the community mobilizing tradition in the civil rights struggle, so external leader inspired by Dr. King's oratory, press coverage usually, and a very pointed goal, desegregation. And Holmes County, Mississippi, something very different was happening, and that was the young African-American workers with SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, living in these poor communities in Mississippi, including in Holmes County, and politicizing local residents over local issues, trying to develop local leaders that could carry this agenda kind of for the long term. And in 1963, it was Hartman Turnbow and 13 others who stepped forward to register to vote. And next day, it was a sheriff and his deputies that shot into Hartman's house, firebombed it. Hartman Turnbull himself was arrested for arson, for setting fire to his own house, along with 3 SNCC workers, including Bob Moses.
Yeah.
And that began the civil rights struggle in Holmes County. And it was a long, painful process, but they transformed the politics and the civil rights of that place. Still economically, a lot to do. Now, the really interesting thing, and the thing that I derive hope from, is the history behind that. So in 1941, the federal government bought 5 failing white-owned plantations and sold the 10,000 acres to 96 black sharecropping families. Didn't give, sold long-term low-interest loans, the land, but also included mules, tools, seed, and advice. And they transformed these sharecroppers into independent farmers, still poor, but they had an independence that no one else had. So the civil rights struggle in Holmes County wasn't led by teachers or preachers, but by these farmers, because the teachers and preachers were all as dependent on the white elite as anyone else. They could be put off their land. They could be denied credit. They had all sorts of repercussions if they stepped out of line. But these independent farmers, as poor as they were just that. They were independent. And so it shows me that actually our government can deal with the underlying causes of poverty and not just the symptoms. And there's a great example of that taking place.
Well, and that's a great example of how you might interpret underlying cause.
Right.
Because in that case, what you're talking about is access to land ownership, which is modern poverty programs don't tend to go there, right? We're not going so far as to share the means of production.
Right.
It's more about distributing resources and so forth. So very interesting, but also that one change like that 23 years later can still be rippling outward and
still
alter
is to this day. It is extraordinary.
Yeah.
That little, and it was disbanded by Congress for being socialist. But the seeds for change have been sown in Holmes County, and it transformed. The SNCC workers were working in Greenwood, Mississippi. They had such trouble, and they actually had a farmer from Mileston come to them in Greenwood and say, "Can you come to Holmes County and help us out?" Because again, the SNCC workers were completely unaware that this little community of Mileston, they had and they had their own cotton gin, this independence, as I say, still poor, but black farmers, and they were right at the forefront of the civil rights struggle.
Well, I want to bring up another phrase that you use in the book and is common in sociology, and that is social reproduction.
Right.
What does that mean?
It means why working class kids end up in working class jobs, how social inequality is reproduced from one generation to the next. So the problem with having this pyramidal and even more Eiffel Tower class structure or wealth in this country. It's not just that the rich are so rich and the poor are so poor, but that tends to be reproduced from one generation to the next. Not completely. So we do have a mobility, but actually the class into which one is born has a huge impact of where one ends up. And so social reproduction tries to show why that is. And I think the reason Ain't No Makin It did well is because it's trying to connect some of those theories to actually what's happening on the ground. The words of the kids, the actions of the young people in this study. And we can see how those forces are impacting them and weighing down on them, constraining their opportunities. And they react in ways that the outsider just interprets as, these guys are just mad. They're just self-destructive burnouts, end of story. But actually, when you take the time to listen to them, there was this underlying rationale. Ultimately, self-destructive, yes, but it was partly, or in a very major way, shaped by the limited opportunities that they had.
Why do you think it's so hard, then, for people living in that situation? And look, I want to be clear that we're not talking about something that's limited to a particular kind of town,
right?
Particular kind of neighborhood. There are these people in every community in America who belong to these structurally disadvantaged sort of classes. Why is it so hard for people in that situation to look out at the world and say, it's the world. It's the way the world works. It's the way the economy is structured. Why is it so hard to see that? And we tend to blame ourselves or we blame our neighbors along racial and socioeconomic lines.
Right. And it is something that's, not quite unique, but almost unique to the United States. So, my time in Britain, taught me a lot because you couldn't talk about housing projects there because actually social housing was so widespread, a huge swath of the working class lived in what we would call public housing. And so they call council estates. And so there was no shame, attached to that. Social class was acknowledged, and of course, the United States, we're not as class-ridden as Britain, but it is here, and we just deny it. It's not part of our parlance. Hence why I said that, actually Bernie Sanders was quite important, not just from out of politics, but for the wider culture, help us to understanding how our society works. But we're a very, nation that the emphasis is on, that rugged individualism. I live in New Hampshire, where it's really very, very pervasive, and people tend to interpret their situations entirely in individual terms. If I haven't made it, it's my fault. And
what would it take to change that, in your opinion? I mean, that's deep-seated stuff.
No, it is. It is deep-seated. So I'm not big on sort of arguing with people. I've seldom shifted folks. For me, it took an experience because when I went down, to this low-income housing project, I'm dealing with 11-year-olds who are saying there's no point in me going to college. I'm just going to end up in a lousy job anyway. What's the point? And, I was like, it's self-defeatism, Frankie. You can't, let's look at the opportunities that are out there. It may feel like that to you, but that's not the case. I had to learn that actually parroting that, what I call the achievement ideology, the way I was motivated, to try and motivate Frankie, just work hard, get good grades, you'll do well in school, you'll go on to college, you'll get a good job, you'll make a lot of money. The problem with that was that it ignores the barriers to success. So by parroting that, what does Frankie then make of his circumstances?
Right.
So I live in a housing project. So what? My parents are lazy or stupid or both. That's the implication. And some kids came to see that, and they do. They can internalize that inadequacy. So for me, it was that experience, and not a cursory one. I had to get stuck in and live in this housing project, running this youth program to change. And so, for me now and the kind of community work that I've done the last 25 years is I seldom try and argue with people, but I do try and create opportunities for them to have an experience that has them rubbing shoulders with and has them questioning some of their own assumptions and biases and prejudices. I've found that's sometimes what it takes for people to change. So this youth program's still going. And now I've moved back home. I was 25 years in Britain. I'm a parish priest and of an Episcopal church, look after two churches in very contrasting communities. But one of the things we do is this summer camp is still going. So we welcome these kids up and give them sort of all these outdoor experiences. So I get my congregation involved. And, most of the kids now are kids of color, all from low-income backgrounds. And, the folks I have coming to lead them on the hikes, to take them swimming, to help cook the food, to help run the barbecues and spend, a couple of days with them. And they come away, and what do they say? My goodness, they're exactly like my grandchildren, only politer, right? That through Ain't No Makin It, even the kids who were, had turned to the underground economy and were dealing drugs and were going to prison, actually their aspirations were completely conventional. They aspired to having a home of their own, to being able to raise a family. The means by which they went about it were completely different and were criminal. But there's a sense in which their aspirations were really conventional. They just
conventional in the sense that they're universal. That's what everyone wants.
Right, indeed.
Right?
Indeed.
I love this phrase, achievement ideology, because there's a flavor on the word ideology that sort of suggests it's not the only way to look at it.
Right.
An ideology is something that can change, can be abandoned. And so I find hope in the fact that we're talking about that.
Right.
I also find hope in the fact that, whatever you may think of Bernie Sanders' politics,
Mm.
there are a lot of people who resonate with this message.
Mm.
When he talks about social justice
Right.
and so forth, there are a lot of people who get behind that. Maybe that's also a sign of hope.
Indeed.
We're almost out of time, but I want to turn to something that you've already brought up, and that is that in addition to a scholar and sociologist, you're also a priest.
Mm.
In what ways have you personally seen a link between your scholarly work and religion? And how do they belong together and work together?
Right. So I wasn't raised in a religious family at all, and it was an experience actually overseas. It was an interfaith experience, living with a Tibetan Buddhist family for 4 months. And you couldn't live with that family and not see the value of religion, spirituality, the interior life. When I came, so this was when I was actually still working in this housing project. It was right after the first summer. So it was 1981. And I came back and I was just much more open to religion, spirituality. I started reading the Bible, and I was gobsmacked at the way it was jibing with what I was doing, the community work. I had no idea that poverty was a scandal to God, that, I'm reading the Hebrew scriptures, I'm reading, the New Testament. And even before Jesus is born, we have Mary, in this Magnificat or song saying, I will cast down the mighty from their thrones, the poor will be lifted up. I'll send the rich will be sent empty away, in this kind of reversal. And then, you're reading about the words and the ministry and the teaching, the life, the death of Jesus. And it's all about identity with solidarity with the suffering and with the poor.
Yes.
And so it just really resonated with my community work. And I was amazed that this stuff was all in the Bible. And yet, in these United States of America, our interpretation of that, of conventional religion, Christianity, is oftentimes profoundly conservative. And so one of, my missions is to recover that, repressed elements of the Bible that haven't been repressed in places like Latin America and other parts of the globe, but in this country, largely have been.
Well, it's a question that comes up often. Is like, where is the church in these conversations? Are you seeing movement back in that direction?
I am. So there's a movement called Reclaiming Jesus, and there hasn't been a great deal of the national leaders, but my boss, the presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church of the United States, Michael Curry, whom no one probably heard of a year and a half ago outside the Episcopal Church, but then did the wedding, the royal wedding, and had that very powerful sermon about, the power of love. He's one of the few national leaders that's gotten behind this, and they're very explicitly trying to reclaim Jesus, his message, and all what he stood for, because it's been so hijacked by those for not just political conservatism, but a very intolerant attitude around sexuality, around gender, which just does not jibe with the example of Jesus, who is constantly embracing those who are marginalized, touching the untouchable, including them, making them feel that they belong.
Well, it's what got him in such deep trouble.
Right. Indeed. Yeah.
So maybe part of the issue is we just don't want to make waves. We don't want to be in deep trouble.
True.
We have to perhaps embrace that again, that these issues that we've been talking about are simply not going to change until we take them on in the same way that Jesus did, and others who've had similar messages and cultures throughout history.
And Hartman Turnbow back in Holmes County, and those early civil rights leaders, not just the national renowned ones, but those local leaders who are literally putting their life on the line and saw so clearly that this was part of their Christian vocation and their Christian spirituality. Changing the songs, woke up this morning with my mind stayed on Jesus, to woke up this morning with my mind stayed on freedom. That's actually the title of the book that these kids in Mississippi, they did this oral history in Holmes County and captured these stories for posterity and titled the book, Mind Stayed on Freedom.
Oh, wow, that is powerful.
It is.
So I want to do something that I do a lot with conversations, and that is to challenge you to give the average listener, somebody just out there trying to make the mortgage, they're trying to raise their kids, one or two or three things that they could do right now to move in this direction.
Sure. So what we want to do is to we've got all the right rhetoric in this country as a land of opportunity. We just need to make it the reality. So schooling, so little things that could be done. Advocate for prison reform. One of the things I found with these kids who were imprisoned, what motivated them and was almost impossible to happen is their kids to visit them in prison. Make it easy for kids to be able to visit their parents in prison. If you want to motivate people, if you want to reduce the recidivism rate, then just allow that. A very simple thing.
Sure.
Schools, goodness me. And, I live in New Hampshire where we don't have a state income tax or a sales tax. We fund everything by property taxes. So poor communities are not just getting inferior education, but they're having to pay a lot more for it. For goodness sake, in poor communities, let's have smaller class sizes. Let's invest more in them. So advocate for that in your local community. And just try to look beneath the surface reality. And, especially in poor communities, whether white or people of color, try and imagine what's going on beneath the surface and don't be so quick to condemn behavior that we don't really understand.
I love it. Well, and I would add to the list something that you said earlier, and that is become a sociologist.
There you go.
Even if it's just an armchair sociologist in your own home, just understand these things and learn how to challenge your own biases and myopic ways of looking at things.
Right.
Jay, I've enjoyed the conversation very much. Thank you for joining me.
As have I. Thank you.
Think Radio Presents is a production of Alan Wartes Media. The show's producer is Isa Forrest. Associate producer, Aaron Lewis.
Thanks for listening. Become a Think Radio Presents partner at patreon.com, and you'll also get access to premium content you won't find anywhere else. To leave a comment on today's show or to suggest a great story for a future episode, visit thinkradiopresents.com. Tune in next week for another great conversation on Think Radio Presents Think People.